Science and Environment correspondent Audrey Tan is here to make sense of these latest announcements. Audrey, let's talk about GreenGov.SG first. It builds on an existing initiative that's been in place since 2006. So what's new about this one?
So there are a couple of new pillars for GreenGov.SG, and Ms. Grace Fu said that more details will be released later in the year. But I guess one of the more headline new targets that are set under GreenGov.SG is for the public sector to peak its emissions by 2025. So that means the public sector, government offices and public infrastructure would actually increase emissions until 2025 before ramping down. So a similar target was set nationally, and that was to peak emissions by 2030. So what GreenGov.SG is for the public sector to peak its emissions 5 years before the rest of the nation.
On that note, Audrey, let's clear something up here, because I had the impression that under the Green Plan 2030, we're aiming to reduce emissions by 2030, but what you just said, and that's according to GreenGov.SG, the target is to maximize emissions by 2030. So isn't all of that counterintuitive to the whole green effort to reduce our emissions?
So the 2030 target was actually set some time ago as part of our targets under the Paris Agreement. So Singapore has pledged that it will peak its emissions at 2030 and then halve that amount by 2050. And the longer term target is for us to reach net zero as soon as possible in the second half of the century. So like you pointed out, it means that we still have 9 more years of increasing emissions, and that is something that has been the subject of criticism among the environmental community here. But as we have heard from the ministers today, there's a lot of talk about trade-offs and constraints. So right now, I guess Singapore is trying to manage within these constraints that the government has set out and try to reduce emissions as far as possible. But I guess despite our efforts, in terms of like petrochemical industry is not going to go away so soon, and we can continue seeing our emissions go up in the nearer term future.
Right. I want to pick up on that.
Trade-offs?
Audrey, on trade-offs, because we heard Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean as well said that the trade-offs for greener Singapore are much starker. What does he mean by that?
So I think he mentioned 3 different types of constraints, right? Land, manpower, and access to renewable energy. So access to renewable energy is a pertinent point because if you look at the majority of our emissions, they come from the use of fossil fuels for our energy. Currently, 95% of our energy comes from the burning of natural gas. It is the cleanest form of fossil fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel nonetheless. So what are alternatives to fossil fuels? You would need renewables. And in Singapore, we don't have large acres of land for extensive solar panel farms or solar farms. We do not have access to tidal energy, wind energy, geothermal energy. So we are constrained in this area. So that's one. In terms of land use, it has come up in SM's speech, and it has also come up in interviews that I've done with, like, for example, National Development Minister Desmond Lee, who has talked about how Singapore is a city that needs to incorporate all the needs of a country. So if you think about countries overseas, right, they can locate everything they need within a city, but things that maybe like in terms of meeting water needs or farming for food, they can always locate it on the outskirts in rural areas, but this is something that Singapore does not have. So it has to ensure that it meets all its needs within our 720 square kilometers of land. So that is another constraint that we have to deal with. And the last thing is manpower, right? We have seen what Exxon has said recently about cutting jobs, same with Shell, and there's always the need to transition away from it. But in this great green transition, it is the workers who will have to bear the brunt of this. So I guess that's what he meant by all these constraints that Singapore has to deal with, and how we would face the cost of these challenges more harshly than perhaps other countries as well.
I see. Well, let's talk more about what Ms. Grace Fu also mentioned about how we're going to, shore up our coastlines against rising sea levels. Could you share more on Singapore's plans to protect our coastlines?
Yeah. So, earlier what we're talking about emissions and all that comes under mitigation, right? How Singapore wants to reduce its carbon footprint. But of course, when you talk about climate change, you cannot just look at that. You have to look at how you're going to prepare for the effects of climate change as well. So sea level rise is, of course, an issue that is of concern for us, a low-lying country. So she did mention that there are 4 areas, 4 different coastlines that are being looked at. Earlier, just now we've seen the sites, City East Coast and Jurong Island. These are areas that have already been identified in public speeches before. And at that point, the government has said that these areas are identified because they are low-lying, they are highly urbanized. Your East Coast Park is there, and Jurong Island is highly, a lot of important infrastructure there as well. So today what we've heard is that the northwestern coast will also be looked at, and the northwestern coast is perhaps, you will be familiar with places like Sungai Buloh, Kranji, right? So that is an area, and why PUB said is because firstly that's where a lot of key infrastructure are located. Think your Woodlands checkpoint, your Kranji reservoir, they're all there. And also it's going to be a lot, the location of many important industries, so timber industry, and what we have seen with the Agri-Food Innovation Park, there's going to be a huge agri-tech sector is there as well. So that is an area that Singapore is looking into to try to beef up and show up our coastal protection as well.